Hello and welcome to the Russian Empire History Podcast, the history of all the peoples of the Russian Empire. I'm your host, JP Bristow, and this is Season 1, The Forest, the Steppe, and the Birth of the Russian Empire, Episode 89, Gediminas Part I. As we heard a couple of episodes back, a new dynasty, which will in the future be named the Gediminids, appeared through the brothers Buttigiedis and Butvitas, or Pukeveras sometimes. Like much about early Lithuania, their origin is something of a mystery. They do not appear to have been related to their predecessor, Gediminas, as they made no claim to be his natural successors, and Gediminas' daughter later marries Gediminas' son. The later Russian text, Zadonshina, a work about the Battle of Kulikovo, written sometime around the end of the 14th century, describes the grandsons of Gediminas as the descendants of someone named Skolomend. Unfortunately, this name doesn't appear in any other surviving texts, although there is a duke called Skiermont in the chronicle, and there was a prominent Sudavian warrior named Skumantas in the 1240s, who have been suggested as candidates. The Sudavians were among the Balts who had fled into Lithuania rather than submit to the order, so it is possible that one of their leaders could have married into the Lithuanian nobility. Another theory is that the brothers were related to Vilkela, who was one of the senior dukes in that group that came together to sign the treaty in Galicia right at the beginning of Mindaugas' career. If you recall, that was the first mention we have of Lithuania emerging from the Baltic tribes. While their origins are unclear, we know better what comes next. Butvitas had at least 4 sons: Vytenis, who ruled as Grand Duke for 20-odd years, Gediminas, who succeeded him, Voin, who would rule in Polotsk, and Fyodor, who would rule in Kiev. The descendants of this generation are going to rule Lithuania, plus Poland later, until 1572, and will be a major presence in the podcast for the next couple of centuries. As I mentioned previously, contemporaries saw Vytenis as the more impressive of the brothers, a vigorous military leader and diplomat who distinguished himself against the knights and laid the foundations for Lithuania's rise to the leading power in Eastern Europe. But since around the 16th century, he has been very much overshadowed by his brother. Gediminas first appears in the chronicles as his brother's representative in the northwest. He kept the frequently rebellious nobles in line, led attacks against the order, and built castles on the Nemunas and Jura rivers. The main reason for Vytenis' eclipse was that he died without heirs, sometime after October 1315, leading to Gediminas taking over as Grand Duke to rule for 25 years, before leaving his duchy to several impressive sons. For contemporaries, it appears that the difference in assessment was more one of personality. Vytenis seems to have been a dynamic and imposing character, where Gediminas was quieter, rather than a question of their achievements. Although Vytenis was the first duke to deliver stable, long-term rule and laid the foundations for Lithuania's rise, it's hard to argue that Gediminas did not achieve more. At this point, it's worth a short digression to consider why the rulers were Grand Dukes rather than kings, like Mindaugas, and how they themselves saw their position. Part of the answer lies in the conceptualization of empires and kings. For the Catholic West, there could be only one empire, Rome, and its successor, familiar to us as the Holy Roman Empire, although it was not referred to that way at the time, and the role of the Pope in recognizing titles. We'll get into this in more detail at the beginning of the second season. Gediminas referred to himself as ruling by the providence of God. This was not just a nice turn of phrase. It was saying that his right to rule was divine. He was not chosen by men. It's very likely that as the ruler of Lithuania, he was the high priest of the Lithuanian pagans, although our information on this subject is pretty scant. It also echoes papal rhetoric. In his diplomatic correspondence with the West, Gediminas refers to himself in Latin as Gedimina Dei gratia Lithuanorum et multorum Rutenorum rex. Gediminas, by the grace of God, King of the Lithuanians and many Rus, or in German as König von Litauen, King of Lithuania. He later added Princeps et Dux Semigali, Prince and Duke of Semigalia, because he claimed that province under his protection after its own rulers were killed by the knights, but did not yet assert royal rights there. Catholic correspondents, however, referred to him as Rex Sive Dux, King or Duke, leaving it ambiguous as to which title be recognized, while the Pope referred to him in a letter to the King of France as one who styles himself king. In the Catholic world, you could not just call yourself king, which sometimes gets into minutiae that seem strange to us today. Sometimes it could be acceptable to call yourself the king of a people, but not of a place. Or sometimes you could call yourself a king in a place, but not of a place. In this case, the effect was that you were recognized as a king at home, but not if you were outside of your kingdom. The Pope often treated recognition of kingship as a reward for conversion. Of course, we've already seen this with Mindaugas, who later recanted, and with Daniel of Galicia, who was recognized as King of the Rus, but received no actual support to go with it, partially due to failing to switch to Catholicism. Clement IV will offer the Lithuanians recognition of their royal title later, but he did not follow through on the offer. Dei gratia, by the grace of God, the phrase adopted by Gediminas, was used by Catholic rulers who had been recognized by the Pope. Gediminas may have taken it from Mindaugas, or, like the knyazes of Galicia and Novgorod in their correspondence with the West, he deliberately used it as an assertion of his own equality to Catholic rulers. None of the other Lithuanian princes or dukes used this phrase, because they all held their title from the Grand Duke, not God. On his seal, Gediminas is depicted holding his crown in his hand rather than having it on his head. This is a statement that he controls the crown. No one else has crowned him. Although the rulers of Lithuania are conventionally referred to as Grand Dukes, which was a title adopted in imitation of the Rus, Grand Knyaz, they did not officially adopt this style until somewhat later. Gediminas' son, Algirdas, calls himself Magnus Rex Supremus Princeps Veliki Knyaz. The adoption of this title grew out of Lithuania's ambition to rule all the Rus, and was most likely an assertion of equal status in Rus to their rivals in Moscow. The Lithuanian word is kunigas, which we can see without too much difficulty is related to the German König, English king, and Slavic knyaz. So you might ask, why am I calling them Grand Dukes when I rejected this term for the Rus knyazes? I admit this looks somewhat inconsistent, but it mainly comes down to Lithuania joining that Catholic system of recognition of title. As we've just heard, their use of Rex was not generally recognized as legitimate in Western sources, and although some moves are made towards recognition, they're not followed through. Second, as we shall hear later, the Lithuanians make recourse to this idea of the Pope having the authority to say who is king or emperor themselves when they dispute Muscovite claims and titles, which we will hear a lot about fairly soon. So, what's sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander. Finally, if you recall our previous discussion, contemporary writers did call the Rus knyazes kings, and the attempts to downgrade them to dukes came later, perhaps even partly under the influence of the Lithuanian situation. And of course, the idea that the Pope is the arbiter of titles outside of the Catholic world is not one to be taken seriously. At the same time, while this question will provoke a lot of arguments with Moscow in the future, you should not think that it means that the Grand Dukes are not in some way the ultimate rulers of Lithuania, or that we should not think of Lithuania as a state, or indeed, as we've already mentioned, in practical terms, as an undeclared empire. As historian Stephen Rowell states in Lithuania Ascending, a pagan empire within East Central Europe, the nature and titulature of the Lithuanian Grand Dukes was unique, which is another similarity with the Rus case. As Christian Raffensperger notes, the standard view of a king as a monarch does not fit well almost anywhere in medieval Europe outside of France and England. The Grand Dukes concluded international agreements and granted migrants the right to live in Lithuania, sometimes under a specific German law code. They imposed taxes and tithes, which were collected in silver and in kind, and they granted privileges, releasing some from payment. They had the right to summon men under arms to campaign on their orders and to take part in public works, such as building castles, bridges, and highways, including from their Rus territories. The Lithuanian Chronicle makes particular note of Rus archers serving in the Lithuanian army. The Grand Dukes could grant hereditary property rights and also refuse to recognize rights of inheritance. This right was used in some cases to place Lithuanians on the throne of some Rus kняжества. The Grand Duchy itself, though, became the undisputed patrimony of the Gediminids. We heard at the beginning of the episode how their family origins were unknown, and a couple of episodes back about the series of short-lived dukes preceding Vytenis. From Gediminas onwards, the succession was not in dispute, and the only rivalry was within the family. The other Lithuanian princes, dukes, and nobles appear to have often acted as the Grand Duke's representatives. They were given charters, swore loyalty, and provided military service in exchange for their estates. The dukes were usually related to the Gediminas and had a status similar to Western princes. Noblemen, however, were not permitted to marry into the royal line. Lithuania adopted the institution of boyars from the Rus, including the same word. They were a body of advisors who provided the Grand Duke with military and other services. The Teutonic chronicles call them a parliamentum. Vytenis and Gediminas would gather a council before commencing a major campaign. If there was a significant foreign policy decision, Gediminas would summon his sons and the boyars to ensure that it was presented as a consensus. One example was his diplomatic victory in securing a papal legate's endorsement of a truce in 1324, without Gediminas making any reciprocal commitments with respect to Christianity. At the height of the Lithuanian Crusade, anti-Catholic feeling was strong among both his Lithuanian pagan and Rus Orthodox boyars. Achieving agreement here meant getting the legate to go along with restrictions on Catholic missionaries in Vilnius, and getting his nobles to agree to restrictions that were not too onerous. Gediminas appears to have been particularly adroit at dealing with his nobles. Although defections and rebellions had been common before his reign, no one of significance defected from Lithuania to either Prussia or his Rus rivals while he was Grand Duke. Gediminas decided to divide Lithuania between the duchies of Vilnius and Trakai. Some historians have argued that this derived from his experience sharing power with Vytenis, but there's no concrete evidence that they did share power as equals. Another motivation could have been to head off a rivalry between his sons by giving them equal responsibilities. But most historians see it as arising from the needs of the two main areas that Lithuania had to focus on: defense against the Order in the west, and expansion into Rus in the east. Some historians have argued for Lithuania having a tradition of brothers co-ruling. However, the arguments against this appear to be stronger. There's no evidence for some of the claimed pairs, such as Vytenis and Gediminas, actually co-ruling. At other times, there were more than two brothers wielding power. And whatever the case, Vilnius is clearly regarded as supreme. It's better to think of it as another example of several princes from a ruling family collaborating, with one acknowledged as senior, as we've seen in one form in Rus and could be found in other European countries at the time. Under Gediminas, Vilnius becomes established as the permanent capital, after the Grand Duke had previously had a travelling court, as was quite common in the medieval period. Gediminas has sometimes been credited with founding Vilnius, but it was more a case of transforming it into a major town. There had been a smaller settlement at the site for around 3 centuries. The confusion arises from the Lithuanians adopting the word gorod from the Rus, which originally meant a citadel, although in modern Russian it means a town or city. So, Gediminas did build 2 castles, Gorod in Vilnius, but did not found the Gorod of Vilnius. Neither of the 2 castles was the brick tower that bears his name today. Instead, they were stone-walled buildings around a wooden keep, and a house of Franciscans who provided him with secretaries, scribes, and interpreters. A pagan temple was created in the ruins of the cathedral that Mindaugas had started but never completed. But Gediminas also built Catholic and Orthodox churches for his merchant and artisan communities. These were soon followed by a German quarter, the Hof, and a kontor for merchants from Polotsk. The Rus merchants lived in a Ruski Kaniec, or Civitas Ruthenica, which was near the eastern of the 2 castles. Westerners, mainly Germans, lived in the Latinsky Dvor, on the road south of the royal castle. Both the Catholic and the Orthodox churches were dedicated to St. Nicholas. Medieval Lithuania was a mainly agricultural society producing grain and linen. Most of the population was peasants, who were linked to the manorial system, living and working on farms belonging to the boyars and dukes. Slaves were also common and provided most of the domestic labour in the houses of the nobility. Although, as noted back in earlier episodes on the Balts, they had been relative latecomers to large-scale trade, Lithuania was in an excellent position to capitalize on its new opportunities. Those non-Lithuanian narratives we discussed that have downplayed or even ignored the Lithuanian role in the rise of Lithuania have tended to deride it as poor and destitute. But even if Lithuanian peasants may have been poor and caught in a Malthusian trap, this does not mean that the nobility were relatively poor. The archaeology shows that they enjoyed a wide range of imported luxury goods. They had the gold, silver, and horses necessary to ransom captives from the order and to bribe the knights and reluctant allies from time to time. They should be regarded as the equal of their contemporary neighbours. The growth of the Hanseatic settlements on the Livonian coast had stimulated trade with Lithuania also, and the Lithuanians had been expanding their presence in the parts of Western Rus that were most active in commerce. From the 1250s onwards, Lithuania was becoming a major player. This gave Lithuania the economic power it needed to stand up to the order. The castle building programs are a good example of their capacity to organize and fund large-scale public works, including bringing in stone and brick from Rus, because the local materials were lacking. There is no direct evidence that Gediminas himself was involved in commerce, as was the case with the Rus knyazes, but it seems like a safe assumption. And the more they expanded into Rus, taking over Polotsk, Vitebsk, and bringing Pskov, Smolensk, and Novgorod under their influence, the more important trade became. Relations were particularly strong with Riga, which, as we've heard, had a strained relationship with the knights. By the end of the 14th century, the main trade route from Western Rus to Riga had settled into passing through Vilnius. Gediminas signed treaties with the Livonians in 1323 and 1338 that gave Christian merchants free access to Lithuania along designated routes, and he ensured that these routes were guarded from brigands and safe to travel. For their part, Lithuanian merchants were not regarded as backwards. They received free access to German settlements, travelled to Hanseatic markets, and had the right to borrow money from Christians. Like the Rus, the Lithuanians did not have their own coinage at this time, and used standardized weights of silver ingots. Under Gediminas, Vilnius acquired everything that we would expect to see in a contemporary capital city. Defences, an artisan quarter, stone castles and religious buildings, and a laid-out network of streets and markets. By the end of his reign, it was not the only such town in Lithuania. It was not an economic or political wilderness. Lithuania was growing. It was strong enough to defend itself, and it was ready to take its place in Christendom. At Gediminas' death, it was nearly 10 times the size of the duchy that Mindaugas had started from a century and a half ago. To find out how this happened, we need to catch up on what has been going on in southwestern Rus. Thank you for listening, and until next time, goodbye.